All right, for this session, we're going to look at now taking our model and looking at ways that we can integrate this with external data, in this case, a project schedule. So earlier in the sessions, we were talking about bringing in multiple formats, looking at ways that we could visualize, analyze. In this case, we're now going to simulate the process of the construction of this particular plant. So I want to change gears here real quick and talk a little bit about the current process. So right now, probably most of you are very familiar with Primavera or Microsoft project schedule, and most specifically the Gantt chart. And one of the challenges with looking at schedules with this nature is that as you look at them, one of the things you'll see is that it's hard to differentiate and try to understand some of the relationships between these different tasks. As we're looking at this, we can see we have an activity name, we have a start date, a finish time, and then our relationships of all of these different tasks are indicated by a series of bars and lines connecting those. Now, to a seasoned scheduler, this is probably something that they can look at and conceptualize in their head, but to a majority of users, it's very difficult, if not outright challenging, to try to understand the relationships of what this looks like in terms of planning and on the site. So at Navisworks, what we want to be able to do is to take this rich information from our schedule and integrate it with our model so that we're able to show the components that are referenced by these specific tasks. So for example, we have a specific task that might detail steel erection, or maybe it's excavation. We can associate that task with a group of elements in our model so that we're able to recreate that sequence of events and looking at it from a holistic process, seeing how it impacts the model. We can now understand their possible errors or inefficiencies in the schedule, make changes into that, make changes in the schedule, and then go back and look at some of how those changes are influencing the model and what would ultimately happen when we go out and build this. But more importantly, we can start looking at areas for improvement or great opportunities. So for one thing we might see is that we're focusing a lot of our effort on one small area of the site. We might be running into productivity issues because we have too many people focused on one small portion of that. We can now look at ways that we can branch out so that we have a little more room flexibility, but more importantly, that also becomes a way to help mitigate some of the safety challenges that construction brings. We can also start using this from a planning and a site logistics standpoint, where we can start looking at laydown areas and understanding of where the materials are going to be needed, and start planning how we can effectively bring the materials to the site so that we're not having to move them around, we're not getting damaged, or they're not sitting there and being prone to vandalism or damage just from laying around on the site. So what we're able to do is take this information in the schedule and embed that in the Navisworks model, and now we can create this simulation that shows us the sequence of events based off of the tasks that have been identified. In this case, this is a Primavera schedule. So I'm going to go back to our Navisworks model, and we're going to go back to the same view. And earlier we talked about bringing in these components here in the foreground. This was one of the new modules that was being introduced into this existing plant. And what I want to do is I have a schedule that identifies the sequence of events on those. I want to bring those events in to Navisworks and then recreate the simulation showing us what that current scheduling process looks like. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and open up Timeliner, and this is a feature of Navisworks Manage. We could access that by using the Timeliner icon, so that little purple time icon, or we can go up to Tools and select that. And what you're going to see here is that there's a series of tabs as well as a series of columns within that. And I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the basis of this. When we look at Timeliner as a whole, there's a couple of options we have. One is that we can create a task internally. If we don't have a schedule for it, we can mock up a schedule inside of Navisworks and then kind of do like a what if scenario where let's just look at a couple of sequences and see what that looks like. Or we can get a little more detailed and we can bring in an external schedule. And right now, Navisworks will bring in not only the Primavera, the P3s, but the P6s, but also Microsoft Project or CSV files. If you're working with SureTrack or some of the other scheduling applications, you can bring in the MPX file format as well. And then also for our counterparts over in the EU who may be using Asta Power Project, that is also another recognized format that Navisworks will be able to work with. But let's look at, under the Timeliner, let's start with the first area here, under the taskbar. Let's look at creating some tasks manually, because maybe we don't have a schedule in place yet. So one of the first things that we can do is we can create a series of tasks and link those to link them to a group of objects in the model, and look at some basic scenarios. So I'm going to go ahead and right-click, and what it's going to give me is the option of adding a task. So at the top of the screen you can see it's saying go ahead and add the task. And once I've done that, I can come in now and call this, let's just call this excavation. And what I can do now is I can define my start and end dates. Just basically drag out a calendar, and let's say that this is just going to run for a week. And I'm going to slide this across so that it's a little easier to see. The main things that we need to be able to establish when we create a timeliner is obviously we need to know the start date and the end date, but we also need to know what is it that we're trying to simulate, meaning what objects are there. So let's go back and revisit this concept of our search and selection sets. Recall that we're able to break our model down into these more manageable pieces. This is another area where our search and selection sets become a very useful tool for linking these groups of components to a specified task. So one of the things that you're going to see here is that even though I've created just this basic kind of a generic task, I'm able to now grab a component that would be representative by that. And then we'll also look at defining what type of task that is, meaning is it a construction, is it demolition, is it a temporary item? It could be any number of different components, and we can configure that as well. But let's look at the next step. We've created this new task, we've identified the start date and the end date, and what we need to do now is create we need to identify what component that's going to reference. And we can do this, the easiest way is if I right click on that particular task, it's going to give me the option of attaching a selection set. So if I've already created my search and selection sets ahead of time, if I've done my due diligence and I've gone through and I've broken the model down, I may just simply be able to reach out and grab one of those. And in this case you can see I have a variety of ones that are representative of a smaller portion of the model, but let's just say it's site, and that was our excavation. The next thing that we need to do is we need to be able to define what type of task that is. And what I mean by that is when I run the simulation, I want to be able to look at this and see how all these components are coming into play, but I want to be able to quickly identify, is that new construction? Am I demolishing some items? Are these temporary items like support structures, equipment, fencing, so forth like that? I want to be able to quickly identify that. And the way we can do that is when these components are being sequenced, we can have them appear in a certain color code. So under task type, you can see by default Navisworks gives me three options here. I have construct, demolish, and temporary, and these are the three basic foundations that come with Navisworks. Now I can go ahead and modify these, or I can create my own, but just for general discussion, we'll say that this is a construction approach. And now I can basically go on and continue to add the different tasks and fill out my schedule. What I want to talk about next, and I think this is going to be probably more applicable, is instead of having to create these tasks manually, let's go back to this concept of our project schedule. We've already created this information. We have a detailed listing of our activities, we have our start end dates, and then now we have a Gantt chart which is showing us all of those activities and the relationships of those activities. So back in Navisworks, this time, instead of going ahead and creating these tasks manually, let's link over to that and have that information brought in for us. So at this point, I'm going to click on the Links tab, and what this is going to allow me to do is to create a link to an external Primavera schedule. And I already have one configured in here, but we'll create another one to walk you through the process. So once again, I'm going to right-click in here under the Name tab, and this time instead of adding an event, I'm going to say I want to add a link. And what this is showing me is it's giving me several options here. I can link to, as we mentioned, the MPX, Microsoft Project, or Primavera. I have the P6 version, but if you're working with P3, and then also the CSV file. Now I mentioned that you can work with Ask the Power Project. Typically, when you have to have those applications installed when Navisworks is installed, and then it will create a link for those. At this point, I just have these applications installed, which is why it's only giving me these options. But let's specify Primavera. And what's unique about Navisworks is that it allows me to log in to through Primavera through the Navisworks interface. So I'm able to link in using my login privileges, and it's going to show me the listing of projects which I currently have access to based off of the role that I am been assigned from a Primavera administrator. So I'm going to log in through this is the DSN allows me to specify which Primavera database I want to log into. In this case, I'm working with just one, but now I'm going to use my login username and password, and it's going to validate those privileges. And what you're going to see is now it's giving me a listing of all the Primavera projects. So what we're looking at is all the projects that are currently defined in the Primavera database that I currently have access to. And I'm going to go down and specify a specific one. Let's see, I think we have a petrochemical and process. And once I've done that, what it's going to show me now is a listing of all the objects in all the different column names in Primavera. So by default, the Navisworks will bring in things such as my task name, start date, end date. All that will be brought in for me. But if I have a specific field name that I want to map this to, what this is now giving me the option is to map this over to maybe a user-defined field if I've created some of these in either Primavera or Microsoft Project, or depending on what scheduling application I'm using. So in this case, I'm just going to leave these blank. I'm going to bring over basically the raw data. And what this has done now is it's created this link. And now at this point, I'm able to recreate that task hierarchy, meaning I want to now bring in all that information from that file. And if I right-click on this, it gives me the option. I can add another link if I have another project schedule. But in this case, I want to say, let's rebuild this task hierarchy from that link. Meaning I've linked over, now show me all the tasks. And to specify that, and this will take just a second here, it's once again asking me, are you sure? Is this the process, that the project that you want to import? And now we've done that. And if I go over to my task column, as this is linking in, one of the things that you'll see now is I have this link in place that gives me all of these tasks from my project schedule. And what's also useful is it's brought in not only the start but the end date. And now I have the ability to now take this information, I can now link it to the appropriate element in my model, or grouping of elements. And once again, we'll be using our search and selection sets for that. And then I can run the simulation showing the sequence of events based off of the tasks that have been currently defined in my project schedule. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this for just a minute, because what I want to focus on is this grouping of elements here in the foreground. Recall we used these when we did our clash detection, and there were components that we need to go back and make changes to. In this case, we're taking those same grouping of elements, but now we're able to extract them out and link them to an appropriate task in our schedule so that we can see currently how those are planned out in the construction phase. So let's go back to Timeliner. And one of the options I mentioned is we need to be able to define what type of task this is. So one of the things I've been able to do is, if I right-click on here, I can come up here and attach my selection set where I've created these ahead of time, and I'm able to link over the tasks to, or the selection set to the appropriate task name. And that's that first part of that linking process. Now what's unique about Navisworks is I could have I can do this manually, where I can right-click and map out this task name to the appropriate selection set. But in this case, I used a common naming convention. So if you have access to the schedule ahead of time, you can work it out where you can name your selection sets that are representative of the task names in your schedule. There's ways that we can automate that linking. So in this particular case, if you notice, my selection sets are mimicking the names of my schedule. I'm able to create a simple rule that allows me to map that information over. So this helps speed up that overall linking process. But by default, I'm able to come in here and select those and link that process manually. So once I've linked those, I need to define what type of task this is. And I think we started to mention that, is this a construction? Is it demolition? What are we looking at here? In this particular case, we're looking at pretty much new construction. We're looking at providing this new module, this new component, or grouping of components in this existing structure. So under the Configure tab, this is now where we are able to go in and specify what these different configurations look like. So as I mentioned, by default, Navisworks will give us the construction, demolish, and temporary. However, I can come in here I can right click and create my own task type. And maybe this one is abatement. Maybe there's some existing contamination that I need to take care of. Maybe I have different work packages that I want to be able to track when I run this simulation. I can have any number of different tasks. So you can obviously expand this out if you want to have more task types and be able to reference them. You can also keep it very simple. Down below is our definitions. I mean, what do these tasks look like? So right now, our construction is showing up as a semi-transparent green. When I run my simulation from the start date to the end date, it's going to show up in this 90% transparent green, and at the end of that sequence it's going to show up as it does in the model. Now it gives me some options here for early appearance, late appearance. We can work with that as well. But let's keep this fairly simple. We're looking at just the start and the end dates at this time. I can do the same thing for my demolish and my temporary. If I want to create additional definitions, I can come down here, same thing, can right click, can create a new appearance, and let's just call this one orange, and can change the transparency of that, can come over and choose a specific color. I can create any number of different definitions in here, and once again these can be linked as part of the appearances for my different task types. So once we've defined what type of tasks we want to show in the simulation, we now go back to our task column, and what this allows us to do is, under task type, it gives us our options, and we can go back and select which ones are going to be construction, demolish, abatement, temporary. We can use the control key and select multiple instances as well. Our attached items, we did that earlier where we right clicked, and now it's showing us what has been attached to that item. It's showing us that these current tasks on here are linking over to a specific grouping of items. And the other thing that we can also do to help verify this is on the far right, you can see it's a little blue icon. It's actually a gray icon with a little blue dot in there. When there's no task associated with any of these elements, so let's say on beam 01, I want to detach that selection. What you'll see now is that turns just a gray. So this is kind of an indicator to let us know if there's anything that's been attached to these. So by default, I can quickly scan up and down to make sure that there's tasks associated, or model elements associated with all these different tasks. So I'm going to go back and once again right click and either attach that. And we said that this was a beam B01. And the other option, as I mentioned, was to use rules to help automate some of that. If I wanted to, under my rules tab, I can create there's some basic rules that come as part of the Navisworks system, and I can basically say, map my timeliner tasks from my column name to items with the same name, or in this case number 2, map timeliner tasks from column name to selection sets with the same name matching case. So once again, if I've been a little forward thinking when I laid this out and I create my selection sets in mind with how I was going to link this to my schedule, I can use that same vocabulary, I can use that same naming convention, and then I can have Navisworks come in and create those links for me automatically. So it's a way to automate some of the portion of that where you're not having to go back and manually link over these tasks. I can say, here's my listing of task items for my schedule, here's my selection sets, automate those and link those for me automatically. So once we've gone through this process, I've linked in my project schedule. It's provided me not only the task name but also the start and end date. I've defined what those are going to be linked to, either through manually attaching to a selection set or creating a rule that says link those over to me automatically. And then I've also had to define what type of task is this. Is this a new construction? Are we looking at potential different work packages we want to be able to show? And I can define those as the task type. The last step is now we can run the simulation, which is going to give us the visualization of what this has looked like based off of those current dates that have been established in my Primavera project. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this just so that we have a little more room on the screen. And I'm going to click on the Simulate tab. And what you're going to see is it gives me your standard play buttons. Stop, rewind, fast forward. But more importantly, let me pull this up a little bit here. It gives me a scroll bar here, and it gives me the listing of active tasks. Also, what you're seeing in the upper left-hand screen is a listing of the dates and times. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And I've gone back to effectively March 25th of 2009. It's showing me down here basically in my schedule, but also up in my upper left it's giving me that information. And what's unique about this is when we run this simulation, it can show up down below, but it can also show up on my screen. And I can save that information out as a video so that I'm able to capture this sequence of events, save this out as an AVI that can be distributed to other people on the team if they don't necessarily have access to Navisworks. But what you'll find though is that this file can be saved out, and there's a free viewer out there that any user can download free of charge, and they're still able to play back this animation as well. So once I've gone back to the start date, I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button, and right now you'll notice that there's nothing in my model that shows what those items are. In effect, we're starting at a clean slate here. We want to come in and you'll start seeing the different elements being placed, and once again this is based off of the events of the tasks that have been defined in my schedule. So I'm going to hit play, and as this is going, I'm going to just pause this here real briefly. And that was moving a little fast, but what you were seeing is you started seeing the items come into play, but as this is moving along, I can now drag this slider, go back to a specific date, or I can even open up my schedule and say, well, I need to go back to April 9th. I'm able to quickly dial back to a specific date, and now I can use this as a means to stop and walk around and start investigating how this is being laid out. I may start seeing that I have some items that are maybe hovering in the air. Indicates maybe I have some scheduling logic. It's going to be pretty hard to have a component defying gravity while we're waiting for the substructure to be built out. So this gives us the ability to really start to identify potential conflicts in our schedule and go back and make those changes. This also starts giving us some planning tools where now we're able to look at this and start walking around and start figuring out, is this really the best option for planning this out? Now obviously we just have the structural steel in place, but I can now slide this along and start looking at potential, how am I going to get some of these vessels in place? What kind of equipment do I need? If I have to bring in a large crane, is that going to impact the work that's going on around that at the same time? And these are these kind of what-if scenarios we can start to identify. And this is just by using the basic schedule that's in here. Now this is a fairly simple module that we're incorporating in here, but you can see the power of this. Where we were looking at it from a larger process, we would be able to see, more importantly, how this is going to impact some of the larger components and figure out some of the logistics on how we would incorporate those, erecting some of these larger components within the project. Now I'm going to go ahead and start the play again, and you'll see now as it's moving along, it's putting in some of the additional components. And the nice thing is that I'm able to navigate around this live while this is going on, and this becomes another way that we can start to virtually walk the site. As the superintendent, we may be able to start looking for potential challenges with the existing facility. Maybe there's some safety issues that we need to take into account that we never really thought about, or in this case laydown areas where we need to figure out how we're going to be able to lay this equipment down and then be able to grab it, pick it up, set it in sight, and not really impact some of the surrounding machinery and equipment there. So this becomes a great tool to really look at the current process and figure out ways that are we maximizing the efficiency? Are we having too many workers in one area and we're running into productivity issues? We have some trade stacking issues now because everyone's compiling around this small area. We can start to identify potential issues like that. The other thing we can do with this too is, as I mentioned, we can bring in multiple schedules. So we can look at a Schedule A versus a Schedule B and try to make decisions on what's going to be the best schedule that we want to incorporate. Maybe we have a different design methodology for one aspect, or maybe there's a different construction type that we want to incorporate. Steel versus concrete. Maybe we have different materials and they have different schedules associated with them. We can run these and toggle between them and try to identify what's going to be the more efficient means of scheduling out our application. We can also look at this from a means that, let's say we've run into some potential issues where we had a delay from one of our suppliers, and now we have to figure out how we're going to work around this. We can start looking at what-if scenarios, and maybe we have to accelerate portions of the schedule once that equipment arrives to get on track. We can now look at that and try to see what the impact of that is. So using the timeliner, it really gives us so much more than going back and using our Gantt chart. The Gantt chart does very good of showing us the relationships, but trying to conceptualize that has always been a challenge. So we're taking this intelligence in the schedule, and all we're doing is linking it into Navisworks and really providing a graphical interface to that data. It's giving us the opportunity to see that from a more holistic standpoint, where we can understand which components, where in the site it's being referenced, and allows us to make smarter decisions and tweak the schedule as necessary to maximize the efficiency. So finally, one of the last things we can do is, once I've played through this, I can now take this simulation, and as I mentioned, I can save this out, save this in a file that can be shared with any user, but more importantly, I can also export this out. So same with some of the other options. If I go up to my File menu and go down to towards the bottom here under Export, you'll see that we have any number of items we can export out. There's a couple different file formats. We can save rendered images, viewpoints, as we talked earlier on how I can now capture viewpoints. As a saved viewpoint, I can put comments and redline information. We can save that out. But more importantly, we have one right here for animation. And what this allows me to do is, under my source, you see it gives me three options: current animator scene, timeliner, and current animation. So the current animation was when we created those viewpoints and we stitched them together and we did that quick walkthrough. The timeliner simulation is really what we've just covered here, where I can now take this current simulation with the time and date up in the left-hand corner, and I can save this out as an AVI. I can change the frames per second and what kind of this output size I want to have, and then save that out, and it'll render it out, and then that can be used, can be shared with any number of users. So that's one option. But I think what you're going to find is that probably the more effective way of doing this is to save this as a file. And this is where we're going to get into some of the more advanced options, where we've looked at all of these features in Navisworks. Now how can we work with all these different modules together, and how can we share this information? So one of the options we looked at was taking viewpoints and putting comments and saving that out. At this point, we can now take this model, and I can either save it out as what we call an NWD, or a Navisworks document file, or I can use what's called a publish feature. And what this is going to allow us to do is to take this model, and I'm able to put a title on here. We're going to call this process plant 1. I can put I'm the author, and I can put in additional metadata that describes what's going on in here. More importantly, I can password protect this. So if I want to share this with a user and I'm concerned about it falling into the wrong hands, I can put a password protection. More importantly, if I'm worried about falling into the wrong hands, I can put a password on here, or I can put an expiration date on here where it just says this file is valid only for a certain time frame. At the end of that, the file is rendered useless and basically won't work on any of the systems, and so forth. And I can save this out. There is what's called a Freedom Viewer, and this is available. You can go to autodesk.com and do a quick search for Freedom Viewer, and you can download this. You can open up this file, and it gives you all the read-only options. You still have the general navigation, but you're able to recreate this timeliner sequence. And one of the things that you'll find is that this becomes an effective tool where you can work with a greater pool of members who may not have access to Navisworks, but they can download this free viewer. They're still able to interact with the model. They're still able to see those saved viewpoints, and more importantly, things such as this timeliner sequence, they're able to be able to run through and see the sequence of events as well. So this is looking at timeliner